to Canadh agus Scéalta, where I sing you a song in Irish or in Scots Gaelic, and then I tell you the story behind that song. So I'd like to begin this week's episode by thanking everybody who watched episode 1. And if you have any suggestions for songs for future episodes, any requests, please let me know. I'm open to all feedback and comments. So this week's episode is actually, it's a little bit of a journey to explain. So I was originally going to do a song, an Irish lullaby called Shoheen Shoho. And when I approached one of my professors at the School of Irish Studies at Concordia University, he pointed me to a couple of sources that showed me that, in fact, Shoheen Shoho is one version out of many versions of this song. And I ended up going with a version called Bhean Úd Thíos, which was collected in the early 1800s by a man named George Petrie and was translated for him by a native Irish speaker named Eugene O'Curry. And what this song talks about is fairy changelings. So fairy changelings are, they have to do with this belief that was held in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and I believe in England as well, that a child or a young woman, and I guess sometimes a man too, but generally it was a child or a young woman, could be kidnapped by the fairy folk and replaced with a fairy facsimile. So this facsimile, this copy, was called a changeling. And you could prevent this from happening by using by placing a piece of iron in the baby's cradle, by not going near fairy mounds at night. That seems pretty obvious. And also you could ward them off with crosses made out of rowan wood. Generally, the prime victims for fairy kidnappings were blonde children, unbaptized children, or young women or children that have been hanging around fairy mounds at night. So there are a couple of ways that you can tell that a changeling is a changeling, and there are a couple of ways that you can get the original person, child or woman, back from the fairy world. The way that you can tell if a child or a woman is a changeling is either by making them laugh. There are some sources that say that you can get it to admit that it's a changeling, and then the spell will be broken. So you can trick it into admitting its own identity. And the darker side to this is that you can also torture it out of the child or the woman's body. And if you torture it out, then the original will return. So it's kind of akin to exorcisms in that way, that it's sort of like torturing the evil spirit out to allow the original to come back. And the really sad and dark side to this is that often the belief in that children were changelings, or that young women were changelings, was often ended up in cases of child abuse. And the same goes for the young women. In fact, probably the most famous case happened in as late as 1895 in County Tipperary to a woman named Bridget Cleary, who fell sick and ended up being believed to be a changeling by her husband and by her family. And sadly and horrifyingly, a few weeks after she had gotten sick, she was killed by her husband. She was burnt alive in an attempt to get her original self back from the fairies. it's a really dark and horrible truth, and it's no longer the case in Ireland and Scotland. Like, these beliefs are not still acted upon and believed to be true, obviously. But Bridget Cleary was an example of someone who fell victim to the belief in changelings. There's actually a fantastic book called The Burning of Bridget Cleary by Angela Burke that I recommend if you want to read further about this topic. It's actually got a lot of layers to it, and it's a very interesting and well researched and well written book. So I highly recommend it, The Burning of Bridget Cleary by Angela Burke. And so this brings me back to the song. Bhean Úd Thíos is about a woman who has been taken by the fairies and replaced by a changeling, and it's sung from her perspective. And she has been in the fairy world for a year, and she has found a way to communicate with someone in the human world, to let them know that she is trapped in the fairy world, and that she's being made to be a sort of like a nanny to the fairy children, and that she needs to be rescued. So she gives the listener of the song these detailed instructions on what to tell her husband to do in order to rescue her from the fairy world. And it involves a beeswax candle for protection and a black-handled knife with which he needs to stab a fairy horse, the first fairy horse to emerge out of the mound where she was taken. And if he stabs this fairy horse, then she will be returned to him. And she also leaves these instructions for herbs for him to take, so that she will not be retaken by the fairies. And she says that if he doesn't rescue her, like, he's got one shot, and if he doesn't do it, then she will be made Banrian, queen of the women that have been taken by the fairies. So it's quite a haunting song, and it's a lullaby. So it's used to put children to sleep. It's kind of scary. I would go to bed with nightmares if my parents would sing that to me when I was going to bed. And I chose this one over Shohin Shoho because Shohin Shoho is still about fairy changelings, but as opposed to it being a story about a woman who's been taken, it's just a mother singing to her child and warning him to go to sleep because there are fairies walking on the roof of the house, and that if he doesn't go to sleep, they're going to come and they're going to take him away and take him to the fairy world, and she'll never see him again. So once again, old cautionary tale about changelings to get children to behave, perhaps, maybe also to get young women to behave. Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, fairy changelings, and it's got a lot of lore and stories and songs associated with it. But this song in particular, I think, really captures the sort of the darker side of the belief in changelings. So I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you next week for episode 3 of Canadh agus Scéalta. Bhean Úd Thíos gan trochan, Julio, an degin tosa o famogiaran, Julio, she bliana islan o furiak mi an lanin, Julio, is goroga is jack melissa crocken, Julio, shoe an show mohiak morn my shock, Julio, is molian or agus yanan Scéalta, Scéalta, Omil we agus ceherviachan Scéalta, Scéalta, agus mohian dinyair nascan Scéalta, Scéalta, Shohin, 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 Scéalta, Scéalta, Shohin, 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 Scéalta, Scéalta, Aberlem heila chat marach Scéalta, Scéalta, San Quiniola heirach egri yarnach Scéalta, Scéalta, Scéalta chasad with a heart and loveless Scéalta, Scéalta, San Capel tossig a unas of varna Scéalta, Scéalta, Anoiba vuent an Norris and Yasa Scéalta, Scéalta, Marcul led Ziago Ryan Leshawalia Scéalta, Scéalta, Numera daga shefui on a troshin Scéalta, Scéalta, Gombe me imban rin hernam nasho Scéalta, Scéalta, Shohin, 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 Shohin Scéalta, Scéalta, Shohin, 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 Shohin Scéalta, Scéalta